Bikers harass farmer's daughter. Her father's secret past leaves them stunned. Welcome to an inspiring tale of courage and unexpected strength. Today, we dive into a story where bikers cross the line by harassing a farmer's daughter, only to face her father's hidden past that leaves everyone speechless. Stay tuned to witness the power of resilience and the lessons learned when respect is earned the hard way. The sun hung low over the horizon, casting an orange glow over the small, run-down gas station on the edge of town, Own. It was just another ordinary summer evening in Oak Ridge, quiet town where everyone knew everyone's business. Claire Harper, an 18-year-old with bright eyes and a determined smile, wiped the sweat from her brow as she unloaded bags of feed from the back of her father's truck. John Harper, her father, stood beside her, steady and strong, just as he'd always been. They were used to long days of hard work on their farm, the land that had been in their family for generations. But today, as Claire threw a glance at the distant road, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. A rumble in the distance grew louder, pulling her attention toward the edge of the gas station. Then they appeared. A loud roar of engines filled the air as the gang of bikers tore down the road, their motorcycles growling with reckless power. The Iron Wolves. Claire's heart skipped a beat. She'd heard of them before. The trouble they caused in every town they passed through. The fear they instilled in locals. But they never came this far out into Oak Ridge. The bikers pulled into the gas station, parking their bikes with casual arrogance, their leather jackets glinting in the fading sun. Their leader, Jake Fury Daniels, stepped off his bike first, his dark sunglasses hiding eyes full of mischief and malice. He grinned, his tattoos creeping up his neck, and surveyed the small gas station with contempt, as though everything here was beneath him. Claire held her breath, hoping they wouldn't notice her, that they would just fill up their tanks and leave. But as soon as Fury spotted her, he smirked. Well, look at this little country girl," he called out, his voice loud enough to carry across the gas station. His gang members laughed, the sound sharp and cruel. "I bet you've never seen a real man before, huh?" Claire's face flushed, her hand tightening on the feed bags she was holding. She tried to ignore them, hoping they'd lose interest and move on, but it was clear the Iron Wolves weren't just here for gas. "Hey, country girl," Fury shouted again, stepping closer, his voice dripping with mockery. "What's a pretty thing like you doing in a dump like this? Looking for a ride or just trying to make a real man out of yourself?" The laughter grew louder. Claire's stomach churned. Her father, John, had been silent, his back to them as he filled the truck's tank. Claire could feel his body tense. He had been through enough in his life to recognize trouble when he saw it. Fury's gang circled around Claire like vultures, leering at her, their voices growing more disrespectful. One of them, a hulking man with a patch covering his eye, walked up to Claire and brushed past her, his arm grazing hers as he whispered in her ear, "You sure you're not bored around here, sweetheart? I've got ways to make your day interesting." Her hands shook, but she fought to keep her composure. Her father was still at the pump, his back turned. Claire knew he wouldn't intervene unless it got worse, but she didn't want to make a scene yet. Another biker, this one with a patch reading Viper, grabbed a dirty rag from a nearby counter and tossed it at Claire. "Go clean up, little girl," he sneered, his grin wide. "Country girls love to do chores, don't they?" Claire's heart pounded in her chest as she clenched her fists. She felt a mix of anger and fear rising inside her. Her dad wouldn't stand for this, but she didn't want him to have to fight their battles, not when they were just here for gas. "Hey, Fury," the biker with the patch called out laughing. "I bet this girl doesn't know what it's like to have a man treat her right. Maybe we should show her." The group erupted into laughter again, but Fury raised his hand, silencing them all. He took a slow step toward Claire, towering over her. His voice dropped, low and menacing. "You look like you need a real man to show you how it's done," he growled, his face inches from hers. Claire felt his breath on her face, but she refused to flinch. Just then, her father, John Harper, turned around, his eyes dark with fury. His strong hands gripped the edge of the pump as he slowly approached them. The bikers took notice of him immediately. Fury's grin faltered for a moment, but he quickly recovered. What's this? You going to protect your little girl, old man? He mocked. John's jaw clenched, but he didn't respond. Instead, he walked up to Claire, standing beside her with his arms crossed. His calm presence made the tension in the air even thicker. "Leave her alone," he said in a low, controlled voice. Fury let out a laugh that echoed across the gas station. "Or what? You think you can do something about it?" Grandpa John's eyes narrowed. "I don't think I know," he replied, his voice steady but filled with authority. The bikers who had been so loud and cocky just moments before now hesitated, their arrogance beginning to crack. What they didn't know, what they couldn't have known, was that John Harper wasn't just some old man. He wasn't just a farm owner from Oak Ridge. He was a decorated Marine, one of the toughest men to ever walk this earth, and they were about to learn that lesson the hard way. John Harper had never intended to settle down in a small town like Oak Ridge. His life had been forged on the heat of the desert sun and the adrenaline of combat, far from the quiet farm where he now worked tirelessly every day. But fate had other plans for him. Born in a bustling city in Ohio, John had always been restless. As a young man, he had dreamed of adventure, of pushing himself beyond the limits. So after high school, he enlisted in the United States Marine Corps, eager to prove himself. The military became his home, a place where he could escape the confines of everyday life and experience something real, something raw. He served multiple tours in Afghanistan, where he rose through the ranks, earning the respect of his peers and superiors alike. His bravery and leadership in combat earned him numerous commendations and medals, Distinguished Service Awards, the Navy Cross, and the Bronze Star. The cost of those medals wasn't something that could be measured in pieces of metal. John returned from each tour a little less than he was before, a little more burdened by the horrors of war. It was during his third deployment that he met Emily, a nurse stationed at the base hospital. She had the kind of warmth that made everything feel right again, like the sun rising after a storm. They fell in love quickly, and before long, they were married. The two of them dreamed of building a life together, away from the chaos of war, in a peaceful town far from the noise and violence of the battlefield. But their dreams were shattered when Emily passed away unexpectedly, leaving John to raise their daughter Claire, alone. The loss of Emily nearly broke him, but it also changed him. Couldn't remain the man he had been. The horrors of combat and the pain of losing his wife collided inside him, creating a man who could no longer endure the chaos of city life. That's when he decided to leave it all behind. Oak Ridge was the escape he never knew he needed. John purchased a small farm on the outskirts of town, far from the bustle of urban life. The land was harsh and unforgiving, but it gave him the quiet life he longed for. Raising Claire on the farm was a difficult challenge, but it kept him grounded. As time passed, Claire became his world. Every day was a reminder of the love he once had, and the daughter who would carry on that legacy. Life on the farm wasn't easy. Every morning John woke before dawn to tend to the animals and crops. It was a tough, unglamorous existence, but he preferred it that way. He found solace in the simplicity of it all. There were no bombs, no screams, no bloodshed, just the steady rhythm of the seasons and the unwavering need to provide for his daughter. Claire was his heart. She had inherited Emily's warmth and intelligence, but had her father's determination and grit. John never pushed her to follow in his footsteps. He knew the military life was a hard and unforgiving one, but he did everything in his power to ensure she had opportunities he never had. He worked the land and put in long hours, saving every penny to put toward her college fund. Claire had big dreams, and John would do anything to make sure she could achieve them. But raising a young girl in a small town had its challenges, especially for Claire. She was bright, ambitious, and eager to leave Oak Ridge behind. She dreamed of attending a prestigious college, studying law, and making a name for herself in the world beyond the farm. But those dreams felt distant. Oak Ridge wasn't the kind of place that bred success stories. It was a town where people stayed because they didn't have anywhere else to go. And Claire, like her father, knew that sometimes life didn't give you the luxury of choice. Her relationship with her father was the cornerstone of her existence. John had taught her everything, from fixing fences to the importance of hard work. But there were things John had never shared with her. His time in combat, the things he had seen, the men he had lost, were stories that stayed locked inside him. It wasn't that he didn't trust her. It was that he didn't want her to carry those burdens. Trauma of his past, the weight of the decisions he'd made, was a burden he would carry alone. Claire had never pressed him for details, though she could sense the unspoken pain in his eyes. She knew that her father, despite the strength and resilience he showed on the outside, was a man with deep scars. She respected that, but it also meant that there were times when she felt a distance between them, a space filled with things unsaid. It was the reason she sometimes found herself yearning for something more. John had taught her that being strong wasn't about physical power, it was about enduring and Claire had learned that lesson well. But sometimes, as she worked the fields, or helped her father with the animals, she found herself longing for the life she knew she could have if she wasn't tied to the farm. She often dreamed of the day she would leave Oak Ridge. She wanted to prove that she was more than just a farmer's daughter. She was smart, determined, and capable of so much more. But every time she looked at her father, who had sacrificed so much to give her a better life, her dreams felt a little further out of reach. How could she leave him behind after all he had done for her? Despite the love and respect she had for her father, Claire struggled with the limitations that came with their life. She was more than the small-town girl they saw her as. She was ambitious, hungry for success, and the quiet life in Oak Ridge felt like a cage. But she also felt bound by duty to her father. His sacrifices were never far from her mind. At the heart of her dreams was a desire for freedom. Freedom to choose her own path, to leave Oak Ridge behind and take on the world. But there was always the nagging feeling that her father's protection was the very thing holding her back. John's protective nature was something Claire understood, even if it frustrated her at times. He would do anything to keep her safe, even if that meant keeping her under his watchful eye. She didn't know it yet, but this protective nature, his military training and the scars from his time in Afghanistan, was going to be tested in ways neither of them could ever have imagined. The day the bikers arrived at the gas station would mark the beginning of a journey neither Claire nor John were prepared for. As the day stretched on, Claire couldn't shake the sense of unease that lingered in the back of her mind. She couldn't help but think that life in Oak Ridge, as simple and predictable as it was on the verge of changing forever. And that change would come fast, and it would be brutal. Don't forget to subscribe, comment, and stay tuned for the next chapter. You won't want to miss the storm that's about to hit Oak Ridge. A piece of the small gas station was shattered the moment the roar of motorcycle engines broke through the quiet of Oak Ridge. The sun had barely begun its descent, casting long shadows over the cracked pavement of the station when the bikers arrived. A gang of 5, their motorcycles gleaming in the light, pulled in one by one, their loud engines rattling the windows of the store. The unmistakable sound of revving machines filled the air, instantly disrupting the calm that the small town was so accustomed to. Each bike seemed to vibrate with an intimidating power, the rumble echoing through the gas station as they came to a stop. The bikers dismounted with a swagger, their leather jackets adorned with the insignia of the Iron Wolves, a notorious biker gang known for their ruthless reputation and sense of entitlement. Jake Fury Daniels, the gang leader, was the first to step off his bike. Tall, with a buzz cut and a face carved from stone, he looked like the type of man who commanded attention without saying a word. His dark sunglasses never left his face as he glanced around the gas station, a smirk playing on his lips. His gang followed his lead, each of them equally intimidating, wearing the same leather jackets, boots that clicked loudly against the pavement, and the same arrogant air of superiority. Their bikes, shining and polished, seemed to mock the rustic nature of the gas station, which had been a quiet staple of Oak Ridge for years. The contrast between the wild energy of the bikers and the sleepy stillness of the town was jarring. The air grew thick with tension, the first signs of trouble creeping in as they walked toward the store. Claire, who had been filling a gas canister for her father, turned her head as the bikers approached. Her instincts told her to keep her distance, but she couldn't ignore the overwhelming presence they brought. The way they moved, their eyes scanning the small town like predators, made her feel uneasy. "Looks like a real farm girl," Jake said loud enough for Claire to hear, his voice rough and low. His tone was sarcastic, dripping with the kind of condescension that made her skin crawl. Claire stiffened, but didn't respond. She'd learned to ignore rude comments over the years, especially from strangers. Her father had always taught her that some people were just looking for a reaction, and she wasn't about to give them the satisfaction. But Jake wasn't one to back off easily. He took a step closer, his eyes glinting with a predatory hunger. "What's your name, sweetheart? Or should I just call you country girl?" The other bikers laughed in response, their jeers echoing through the parking lot, adding to the tension. Claire's cheeks flushed, but she kept her composure. She could feel the weight of their stares. She kept her composure. She could feel the weight of their stares, each one of them sizing her up like she was some kind of object to be admired, or perhaps something to be conquered. "I'm Claire," she said coolly, her voice steady but firm. She forced herself to meet Jake's gaze, trying to show him that she wouldn't be intimidated. Jake chuckled, clearly amused by her attempt at defiance. "Claire, huh? You look more like a Caitlin to me. That what your daddy calls you? Or does he prefer something a little more country?" Comment, though intended as a joke, made her stomach tighten, but still she didn't let them see her flinch. It wasn't the first time she'd been mocked for being from a small town, and it certainly wouldn't be the last. But the gang's hostility was a different level, more insidious, more personal. Randy, one of the bikers who had been standing to the side, took a step forward, his eyes scanning Claire with interest. His hand shot out suddenly, as if to touch her arm, but Claire quickly jerked back, the air between them thick with tension. "Careful, Randy," Jake warned with a smirk, watching the interaction with amusement. "She might bite." Randy sneered, his hand still hovering in the air for a moment before he let it fall, clearly annoyed at Claire's rejection. "Didn't think you'd be such a prude, sweetheart." Claire's heart raced. Her instinct was to run, to get away from them before things escalated further. She could already feel the fear rising in her chest. She didn't want to cause trouble, but she also didn't want to let them get away with treating her like this John Harper who had been quietly standing inside the gas station watching the entire scene unfold. Stepped outside, his worn boots made a soft crunch on the gravel as he walked toward the door. His eyes never left the bikers, but he moved slowly, almost deliberately, taking in the situation with a calm that only someone who had spent years on the battlefield could possess. Claire could feel the sudden shift in the atmosphere as her father appeared. The bikers seemed to take note of his presence, though they didn't seem overly concerned. John was a man well into his 50s, his graying hair and weathered face giving him the appearance of someone who had lived through more than his fair share of hardship. His shoulders were broad, and there was something in his posture that made it clear he was no stranger to conflict. "Is there a problem here?" John's voice was steady and low, but there was an undeniable authority in it. The gang barely acknowledged him at first, dismissing him with a quick glance. Jake flicked his sunglasses down just enough to make eye contact with John, but there was no sign of fear. In fact, there was a certain amusement in his eyes. To him, John was just another old man who had no place in their world. "Just talking to the girl, old man," Jake said dismissively, his smirk never wavering. "She's just a little shy, that's all." John stood his ground, his gaze never wavering from Jake's. His years in the Marines had taught him how to deal with men like Jake, how to read the situation, how to spot danger before it became too real. But he wasn't going to make a scene, not yet. He wasn't about to let them intimidate his daughter, though, not without standing up first. Claire watched as her father assessed the situation. He wasn't angry, not yet, but she could see the calm determination in his eyes. A warning. It was the same look he'd worn when he was on patrol, when he had to make split-second decisions that could mean life or death. She didn't need him to protect her, not physically, but there was something about the way he stood there, watching the bikers, that made her feel safe in a way she hadn't expected. The tension in the air was palpable. The bikers, still clearly dismissing John as nothing more than an old man, continued their taunts, but the mood had shifted. Jake's casual insult seemed a little less playful now, and Claire knew knew deep down that the real trouble was only just beginning. Next up, don't forget to subscribe and comment to find out what happens next. Things are about to get real, and you won't want to miss it. Stay tuned. The tension in the air was thick enough to cut with a knife. The bikers had made their intentions clear. They weren't going to leave Oak Ridge quietly. Jake Fury Daniels was clearly enjoying the way his gang was terrorizing Claire. But now his gaze shifted to something else. Something more menacing. "Hey, country girl!" Jake said, his voice dripping with mockery as he gestured toward the gas pump. "Why don't you do us a favor and fill up our bikes, huh? It's what you're here for, isn't it?" Pumping gas for the mighty Iron Wolves. The words hit Claire like a slap across the face. Her heart skipped a beat as she stood frozen, not knowing whether to laugh or cry. There was no mistaking his tone. It wasn't a question. It was an order. "No," she replied, trying to steady her voice. Her hands were shaking, but she clenched them into fists, fighting against the sense of powerlessness that threatened to overtake her. Jake's eyes narrowed, a cruel smile forming on his lips. "No, you're gonna refuse us?" He took a step closer to her, the gang following suit, their boots crunching on the gravel as they surrounded her. The air seemed to grow thicker with every step they took. Claire felt her back press against the side of the gas station building. There was nowhere to run, nowhere to hide. The bikers had closed in, leaving her no space to breathe, let alone move. She could feel the sweat forming on her brow, her pulse quickening, but she wasn't going to let them see how scared she was. "You hear that, boys?" Jake said, turning to the other bikers, his voice loud and mocking. "This girl thinks she's too good to pump gas for us." Laughter erupted from the gang, the sound harsh and mocking. They closed in even further, the circle tightening around her. Randy, the biker who had tried to grab her hand earlier, stepped forward, his eyes gleaming with malicious intent. "Maybe she needs some convincing, huh?" Randy sneered, his eyes scanning Claire as if she were nothing more than a toy for their amusement. Claire took a deep breath, her chest tight with fear. She wasn't going to let them break her, not like this, not in front of her father. But before Randy could take another step, a voice cut through the growing chaos. Calm, firm, and unwavering. "Back off." John Harper stepped forward, his tall frame blocking the view of his daughter. His presence was like a wall, sturdy and unyielding. His eyes were focused on Jake, his gaze sharp as a razor, and he moved slowly, deliberately, his boots making a soft crunch on the gravel with each step. His expression was unreadable. Claire could see the flicker of something dangerous behind his calm demeanor. Jake's eyes flicked over to John, momentarily taken aback. Bikers paused, the laughter dying in their throats as they registered the older man's words. For a brief moment there was a lull in the tension, an almost surreal calm that settled over the parking lot. But Jake was quick to recover. He chuckled, though it didn't reach his eyes. "What's this? The old farmer's got a backbone." He took a few steps toward John, his voice laced with mockery. "You better back off, old man, or you'll find out that not everyone in this town is going to respect you just because you wear a farmer's hat." John didn't flinch. His hands were at his sides, his fingers curling into fists, but he didn't move. He stood there like a rock in the middle of a storm. I said, "Back off," he repeated, his voice quieter now, but with an edge that sent a chill down Claire's spine. She'd heard that voice before. It was the one her father used when he was ready to fight, when he had no other choice. The bikers, still circling them like vultures, exchanged uncertain glances. For a moment, they seemed to hesitate, unsure whether to push further. But Jake wasn't the type to back down from a challenge. "Are you threatening me, old man?" Jake's voice had dropped, turning low and dangerous. He took another step closer to John, their faces just inches apart now. His chest was puffed up, his fists clenched. "You think I'm afraid of some washed-up Marine who can barely lift a shovel?" John's face remained stoic, his expression unreadable. But his eyes, those piercing blue eyes, told a different story. He wasn't scared. He'd been in worse situations than this, and he knew how to handle men like Jake. The years of military service had taught him how to deal with threats. He was no stranger to the battlefield, and he wasn't about to let this gang walk all over him or his daughter. "You don't know who you're messing with," John said quietly, his words carrying the weight of experience. "I'm not here to play games with you. I'm here to protect my daughter. You need to leave now." Jake paused for a split second, his lips curling into a sneer. Then he let out a sharp laugh, his voice cutting through the tense silence. "Protect her," Jake said with a mocking tone. "She's a grown woman. She doesn't need you to fight her battles." He took another step forward, his body tense with aggression. "But maybe you do. You're looking a little soft around the edges, old man. How about you step aside and let the grown-ups handle this?" Claire watched, her heart pounding in her chest. The situation was spiraling out of control, and she could feel the air thickening with each word, each movement. It was as if the world around her had gone into slow motion, every sound amplified in her ears. The bikers were getting restless now, a few of them muttering under their breath, their eyes shifting from John to Claire and back again. They could sense the power struggle between Jake and John, and the tension was palpable. John stood his ground, unyielding. "You don't want to do this," he said, his voice low but steady. "Leave now, and there won't be any trouble." But Jake wasn't backing down. His lips twisted into a grimace as he looked at John, sizing him up like a predator sizing up its prey. "You think you can scare me with your little threats?" he sneered. "I'm not afraid of you." The other bikers watched the showdown with bated breath. Claire could feel her father's protective energy radiating off him, but she also knew that this wasn't just about her anymore. This was about pride, about respect, and about two men on opposite sides of the line, one standing firm, the other itching for a fight. As Jake took another menacing step forward, Claire knew that things were about to take a dangerous turn. She had to do something. She couldn't just stand there and watch her father face down a gang of bikers alone. The thought of him getting hurt, it made her stomach turn. But what could she do? Everything in her screamed for action, for something, anything, to break this escalating tension before it all spiraled out of control. And as Jake's grin widened, it was clear to everyone there. This confrontation was far from over. The silence that followed Jake's last insult was deafening. The air seemed to grow heavier, suffocating under the weight of the impending confrontation. Jake's grin widened as he took another step forward, his gaze locked on John. The gang behind him was restless, eagerly waiting to see what would happen next. Jake had always thrived on intimidation, and now, with the old man standing before him, refusing to back down, his anger flared. He needed to show his dominance. "You think you can protect your little girl?" Jake scoffed, his voice dripping with disdain. "Look at you, all puffed up with pride, like you could actually stop us. What kind of father lets his daughter stand here like this? Weak, useless, pathetic." The bikers erupted in laughter, the sound loud and harsh, their amusement filling the air like poison. It was clear that they saw this as a game, and John was the target. Claire felt her stomach churn, the bile rising in her throat. The words cut deep, and it was becoming harder to hold her composure. She'd always known her father was a strong man, a man who had been to war, fought battles she couldn't imagine, but hearing someone attack him like this in front of her made her blood boil. Jake's words didn't just hurt John, they hurt her too. But her father remained still, unfazed. His gaze never wavered. It was almost as if he had tuned out the noise of the bikers and focused solely on the one person who mattered. "Jake, leave her alone," John said, his voice steady but beginning to gain an edge. "I don't want any trouble with you or your gang, but if you keep pushing me, it's not going to end well for you." Jake chuckled, clearly enjoying the moment. "Oh, I'm shaking," he said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "You think you can intimidate me with your little tough guy act? You don't even look like you could handle a punch, old man." Claire could see the muscles in her father's jaw tighten, a flicker of something darker crossing his face. It wasn't fear, it was resolve. He wasn't just going to stand there and let this man mock him, mock his family. Not when it was clear that they weren't just playing around anymore. Jake stepped closer, his hand reaching for the gas pump nozzle. "You know what I think," he said, his eyes glinting with malice. "I think you need a lesson in respect." Without warning, Jake yanked the nozzle from the pump and waved it dangerously near Claire's face. The sudden motion startled her heart racing as she took a step back. She could smell the strong scent of gasoline in the air, and panic gripped her chest. "You better watch your step," Jake said, his voice low and mocking. "I could just spray you down with a little gas. Maybe then you'll learn how to treat people like us." Laughter erupted from the bikers again, but this time it had a darker, more dangerous edge. It was clear that they were egging Jake on, hoping to see the old man crack. John's calm demeanor shifted ever so slightly. His fists clenched at his sides, and Claire could see the veins in his neck tightening. His protective instincts were coming to the surface, and they were starting to take over. For a moment, Claire saw the Marine in him, the soldier who had fought in wars she couldn't even begin to understand. The man who had survived combat was standing before her now, ready to fight for her, ready to defend what mattered most, but that didn't mean he was looking for a fight. "Don't do it," Jake John said, his voice calm yet firm. "I don't want to hurt you, but if you cross that line, I will." Jake's grin faltered slightly, and for a second, Claire thought he might back off. But then, the malicious gleam returned to his eyes. He wasn't done. "Come on, old man, don't make threats you can't back up," Jake taunted. "You're all talk, and you know it." Suddenly, Jake pulled the nozzle up higher, pretending to aim it at Claire, and a burst of gas sprayed out. Claire's heart stopped. The gas shot out in a fine mist, gliding past her face and soaking into her shirt. She gasped, stepping back, the heat of the gasoline on her skin making her shiver. "That's what I thought," Jake said with a laugh, clearly pleased with himself. "You think you're some kind of hero, but in reality you're just a washed-up soldier pretending to be something he's not." John's eyes narrowed, his body rigid. He moved toward Jake, and the bikers immediately shifted uneasily. Claire could see the intense fury. The man in front of her was no longer just her father. The man who raised her, who protected her, who had loved her. No, he was someone else now. Someone dangerous. Before Jake could make another move, one of the bikers, Randy, the same one who had tried to grab Claire earlier, moved forward, his chest puffed out, trying to push John aside. "This old man's about to learn what happens when you mess with the Iron Wolves." John's reflexes kicked in faster than Claire could process. The biker was barely halfway to him when John grabbed his wrist, twisting it sharply. Randy let out a sharp cry of pain as his arm was wrenched behind his back. Without breaking his stride, John yanked the biker forward and, in one smooth, controlled motion, slammed Randy into the ground with a force that sent dust flying into the air. The impact of Randy's body hitting the gravel was sickening, and for a split second, the entire lot went silent. John didn't even break a sweat. The bikers froze, their eyes wide with disbelief. They had underestimated him. Randy groaned from the ground, clutching his arm, unable to move. "Anyone else?" John's voice was cold, dangerous, as he turned slowly to face the rest of the gang. He didn't need to say another word. His actions spoke louder than anything he could have said. Jake stood there, his grin now replaced with a mask of confusion and anger. His tough guy persona was crumbling in front of him, and the bikers around him, once full of bravado, were now looking at each other nervously, unsure of what to do next. Claire's heart was pounding in her chest, her mind racing. She had never seen her father move like that before. She had never seen him fight. But there was something about the way he did it that made her feel safe. He wasn't just defending himself, he was defending her, and that made all the difference. The bikers were quiet, the tension in the air was palpable. Every single one of them was waiting for Jake's next move, and Claire knew with a gut-wrenching certainty that whatever happened next would change everything. John stood tall, his gaze unwavering as he surveyed the gang. "You've got two choices," he said. "You leave now and you forget this ever happened, or you stay, and we finish this the hard way. Your call." The bikers shifted uneasily, unsure of what to do. Jake's eyes darted to his gang, and the silence stretched on for what felt like an eternity. But whatever choice they made, Claire knew this. Her father wasn't going to back down, not this time. The air was thick with tension. Every biker, still caught off guard by the quick takedown of Randy, now stood frozen, unsure of what to do next. Claire's heart pounded in her chest as she watched her father, her calm, unassuming father, tower over the gang. It was like the man she thought she knew had disappeared, replaced by someone far more dangerous. It was as if the years of quiet farm life had simply masked the warrior beneath the surface. The bikers exchanged wary glances, their arrogant bravado faltering in the face of John's unwavering confidence. John's gaze swept over the gang slowly, taking in every man before him. There was no fear in his eyes, no uncertainty, just a cold, focused intensity that radiated from him like a force. Jake, still standing stiffly with the nozzle in his hand, swallowed hard. His earlier bravado had evaporated. "What the hell are you?" he muttered, his voice trembling slightly. John didn't respond immediately. He took a step closer to Jake, his movements precise, measured. The gang looked at each other nervously, sensing that something monumental was about to happen. "Did you really think you could walk into my life and intimidate me, Jake?" John's voice was calm, but laced with authority. The words carried weight, and every biker knew this wasn't just a farmer they were dealing with. This was someone who knew how to handle himself in ways they could never imagine. John's gaze hardened as he continued, his tone turning even more dangerous. "You want to know what I am? I'm a retired Marine captain, and I've seen things you wouldn't survive, let alone understand." The bikers stood in stunned silence, their expressions frozen. The revelation hit them like a punch to the gut. John had been hiding this for all these years, his true identity, his experience. But now, in this moment, it was clear. John wasn't just a man who had lived a quiet life on a farm. He had been a warrior, a leader. The realization swept through the group like wildfire, and they all took a collective step back. The cocky smirks wiped off their faces. They were no longer sure who had the upper hand in this situation. And the worst part for them, they had underestimated him. John's eyes locked onto Jake's. "You thought you could break me, humiliate me, and my daughter," he said, his voice even but edged with a quiet fury. "But now it's my turn." With the precision of a well-trained soldier, John moved in a blur. He wasn't acting out of rage. He wasn't out of control. Every step was calculated, every movement purposeful. It was a demonstration of control. Control over himself and over the situation. John reached out, and in one swift motion, he disarmed Jake. With a fluid twist of his arm, the nozzle was ripped from Jake's hand and sent spinning through the air. The biker leader stood in shock, his eyes wide, unable to comprehend what had just happened. Before Jake could react, John swept his leg behind him, causing Jake to stumble backward, his feet tripping over his own body. The gang watched in horror as their leader hit the ground with a thud, his helmet rolling a few feet away. John didn't even break a sweat. Claire stood there, her breath caught in her throat. She had always known her father was strong. But this was something she had never seen before. This wasn't just strength. This was a man who had fought wars, fought enemies, and come back stronger every time. He was a predator, calm, controlled, and ready to strike if necessary. But John wasn't finished yet. He didn't let up on the bikers. His movements were fast, methodical, each biker an obstacle to be dealt with quickly. The second biker, a burly man with tattoos snaking down his arms, rushed at him, fists clenched. But before he could even throw a punch, John sidestepped him, grabbing his wrist and twisting it behind his back in a fluid motion that brought the man to his knees. There was no unnecessary brutality, no out-of-control violence, just swift, surgical precision. The biker let out a yelp as John held him firmly, locking his arm in place. "Stay down," John said quietly, his voice like ice, and the man collapsed in submission. The third biker, a younger guy with a buzz cut, pulled a knife from his belt, charging at John with a yell. Claire's breath caught as she watched him raise the blade, aiming for her father's chest. But before he could get within reach, John moved again, his hands like lightning. He grabbed the man's wrist, twisted the blade from his grasp, and slammed him into the gas pump with such force that the knife clattered to the ground, useless. By this point, The remaining bikers were standing back, unsure of what to do. They hadn't expected this. They hadn't expected someone like John, someone so dangerous, so skilled, standing in front of them. And now, one by one, they were realizing they had made a grave mistake. They weren't dealing with just any old farmer. They were dealing with a Marine captain who had spent years in combat. John didn't even look at the man he had just subdued. Instead, he turned to the rest of the gang, his eyes cold and unyielding. "I've had enough," he said, his voice low but commanding. "You get in my face again and I won't hesitate. Leave now before I make you." The bikers exchanged fearful looks. They were humiliated, unsure of what else could go wrong in this situation. One of them, a lanky guy with a scruffy beard, muttered, "We don't want trouble, man. We're leaving." With a few murmured curses and hesitant glances, the gang backed away. The biker who had been thrown to the ground groaned, slowly getting to his feet, as the others retreated toward their motorcycles. Jake, still dazed from his fall, struggled to get up, his eyes wide with disbelief. He wanted to say something, anything, but no words came. "Get in your bikes and leave," John said, his voice firm. "And don't come back." The bikers didn't hesitate again. They scrambled to start their motorcycles, the engines roaring to life as they peeled out of the gas station, leaving a trail of dust in their wake. Claire watched them go, her heart still racing in her chest. Danger had passed, but her mind struggled to process everything that had just happened. Her father had just taken down 6 men, with nothing but his skill and control. He wasn't just her father. He wasn't just the man who worked the farm and fixed the tractor. He was someone else entirely. A man who had been forged in the fire of war, a leader in the field, and now a protector of his family. And as Claire stood there, watching the dust settle, she realized just how little she had known about the man who had raised her, the man who had hidden his past so well from her, and yet, in this moment, had revealed more than she could ever have imagined. John walked back to Claire, his face still as stoic as ever, but his eyes softened as they met hers. "You okay, kiddo?" he asked, his voice gentle. She nodded, her heart still racing but filled with a strange sense of awe. She'd always admired her father, but now she understood the depths of his strength. "Yeah, Dad. I'm okay," she said, her voice trembling slightly. And for the first time, Claire understood what it meant to truly be safe. The dust had barely settled before the roar of the motorcycles faded into the distance, leaving the gas station eerily quiet. Claire stood rooted to the spot, her body still tense, her heart hammering in her chest as the last remnants of adrenaline slowly wore off. She glanced at her father, who was still standing tall, his posture relaxed, but his eyes sharp, as though he were waiting for another challenge to emerge. But there was no more danger. The bikers had gone. And yet, in the silence that followed, something else lingered. A weight, a heaviness that Claire couldn't shake. The gang's retreat had been swift, but Claire could tell that the moment wasn't over for them. She could almost feel the regret hanging in the air. The bikers hadn't just been defeated, they had been humiliated. Their leader, Jake Fury Daniels, the one who had been so confident just moments ago, now looked like a shadow of the man he had once been. His earlier bravado was gone, replaced by an uneasy quiet as he revved his bike's engine one last time before taking off. The other bikers followed suit, their eyes cast downward as they mounted their motorcycles, avoiding eye contact with one another. They were leaving, but the emotional scars were just beginning to form. Jake, however, lingered. He pulled his bike to a stop, the engine sputtering in the quiet. He didn't get off. Instead, he just sat there for a moment, hands gripping the handlebars, staring ahead at the gas station, where John still stood, the last vestige of strength in his posture. Claire noticed the change in Jake. Cocky smirk that had once dominated his face was gone, replaced by something else, something raw. Was it shame, regret, or was it simply the realization that he had misjudged everything? She turned to look at her father, who had been quietly observing the scene, his eyes never leaving Jake. John's demeanor was different now, though. He wasn't the Marine captain in battle mode anymore. He wasn't the father who had just protected his daughter from harm. Now he was simply a man, calm, steady, yet carrying a sense of unspoken authority. His movements were deliberate. As he turned toward Claire, his voice a low murmur. "You okay, kiddo?" He asked again, softer this time. His eyes softened. Again, softer this time. His eyes softened, and for the first time in what felt like hours, Claire felt a wave of relief wash over her. It was a relief born not just from safety, but from the realization of just how much her father had kept hidden from her, and how much he had just given her in that moment. She nodded, her voice thick with emotion. "Yeah, Dad, I'm okay." There was more to it. There was a feeling deep inside her that she hadn't fully understood before. It wasn't just that she was safe, it was that she had witnessed something much more powerful than self-defense. Her father hadn't just fought for her, he had fought for something bigger. He had fought to show them all a lesson about respect, and she knew, deep down, that she would carry that lesson with her forever. John didn't press her further. Instead, he took a deep breath and looked back at the bikers. Jake, still sitting on his motorcycle, was staring at the ground now, his face drawn. He wasn't leaving just yet. For a moment, John seemed to hesitate, as though he were weighing something in his mind. Then, without warning, he stepped toward the bikers again, walking with purpose, each stride measured. His demeanor hadn't shifted. He wasn't angry, he wasn't gloating, but there was something in the air, something unspoken, as he moved toward Jake. The other bikers had already started their engines and begun to pull away, but Jake stayed behind. He watched John approach, his eyes filled with uncertainty. John's voice was steady, but there was an underlying strength to it that made every word feel like it carried the weight of experience. "You think you've won, don't you?" John said to him, his gaze unwavering. Jake didn't answer immediately. He shifted uncomfortably on his bike, but the words he had once been ready to throw at John were now stuck in his throat. "I didn't want any of this to happen," Jake muttered, finally breaking the silence. "I was just messing around." John's expression remained stoic, but there was a quiet sadness in his eyes now. "You weren't just messing around. You were trying to tear someone down to make yourself feel bigger. But life doesn't work that way. Arrogance gets you nothing but enemies, and respect isn't something you take, it's something you earn." Jake shifted again, the weight of John's words sinking in. I didn't mean to." "I know you didn't," John interrupted, his voice calm but firm. "And I'm not here to punish you, Jake. I don't need to. Life will do that for you. You'll learn eventually that all this," he waved his hand toward the gang of bikers, "is nothing but noise. Real power comes from knowing when to walk away, when to let things go, and when to stand up for what's right." There was a long silence as Jake digested this. His eyes flickered from John to the ground, and for the first time, Claire saw something like humility in his eyes. The arrogance that had once marked him was fading, replaced by something quieter, more introspective. "I'll remember that," Jake said finally, his voice low. John nodded, not offering any more words. He didn't need to. The lesson had been given, and Jake, for all his earlier bravado, had absorbed it in full. As the gang drove off, Claire felt an unexpected wave of respect for her father. But it wasn't just for what he had done, what he had shown her. It was for the way he handled the entire situation. He hadn't needed to throw his weight around or prove anything. Instead, he had been a quiet force of authority, teaching them all that real power comes from restraint, wisdom, and respect. He had never needed to raise his voice to make them fear him, and for that, Claire was beyond grateful. As the rumble of motorcycles faded into the distance, Claire walked over to her father, feeling a lump form in her throat. He had been her protector, but he had also been her teacher. In that moment, she understood him in a way she never had before. She wrapped her arms around him tightly, not caring that they were still standing at the gas station. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "Thank you for everything." John squeezed her gently, his hand resting on her shoulder. "You don't need to thank me, Claire. I did what any father would do." Claire knew that was only part of the truth. He had done much more than that. He had taught her about strength, true strength, and about the importance of standing up for what's right, even when it's hard. Claire pulled back and looked up at her father. Her eyes were filled with new understanding. "You taught me something today, Dad. Not just about fighting back, but about the power of silence, about choosing when to speak, when to act, when to just be." John smiled faintly, his expression softening. "I'm proud of you, Claire," he said quietly. "Proud that you're learning the real lessons." And as they stood there, watching the last of the bikers disappear down the road, Claire knew that her father had just given her a gift she would carry with her for the rest of her life, the gift of wisdom, of strength, and of knowing when to fight and when to walk away. And for the first time in a long while, Claire felt truly at peace. In the weeks that followed the incident at the gas station, the small town of Ashford seemed to hum with a newfound energy. Quiet, tight-knit community, which had always been relatively calm and uneventful, had been shaken to its core by what had happened between John Harper and the group of bikers. News of the confrontation spread quickly, carried from one person to the next like wildfire, and with that spread came something else. Change. People began to look at each other differently, and it wasn't just because of the spectacle that had unfolded before them. The way the townsfolk talked about the event, sometimes with a mix of awe, sometimes with hushed reverence, revealed a deeper shift in their thinking. It wasn't about the drama or the spectacle. It was about the message of standing up for what's right, of not letting bullies, no matter their size or bravado, walk all over others. John Harper had unintentionally become a symbol of strength, a quiet example of how a person could fight without violence, without aggression, yet still command respect. His approach had been methodical and disciplined, his resolve firm and unyielding. It wasn't about dominating others. It was about showing them where their boundaries lay. At the local diner, the story of John's calm but firm confrontation was told over and over again, usually in hushed tones, almost like a whispered legend. Women discussed how proud they felt of him, not just as a man who defended his daughter, but as someone who had shown them what it meant to stand tall in the face of adversity, without being loud or brash. Men talked about the way John had handled the bikers, how he didn't raise his fists, but instead used his presence, his calm, to put them in their place. It became a conversation starter, a reminder to everyone that the small town of Ashford wasn't just a place for quiet living. It was a place where people could find the courage to stand up for each other. Claire had noticed the shift in the town, too. She walked through the streets with her head held higher, no longer just the quiet daughter of a farmer, but the daughter of a man who had made a stand for what was right. People greeted her with more respect now, their glances warmer, their smiles brighter. It wasn't just that they had seen her father's strength, they had seen hers too. They had seen her stand by his side, unwavering, even when things had gotten ugly. It was clear that the incident had changed something in her as well. But the most significant change was in the people who had been the catalyst for that moment of transformation, the bikers themselves. A few weeks after the confrontation, the bikers who had caused the ruckus that day returned to the gas station. Jake, Randy, and the others rolled in on their motorcycles, their engines rumbling low as they parked. This time, there was no taunting, no obnoxious behavior, no mockery. There was something different in their demeanor, something that hadn't been there the first time. John was there, as he always was. His presence was steady, unassuming, and yet there was something about the way he stood there that immediately captured the attention of the gang. It wasn't a stare of dominance or aggression. It was simply the fact that John had already done what needed to be done, and now he was content to simply live his life. He wasn't looking for an apology, and that was exactly what made him so commanding. Jake dismounted from his motorcycle first, his expression far more somber than it had been on that day. Randy followed suit, his shoulders slightly hunched, as if he carried the weight of something heavy. They both approached John slowly, their boots crunching on the gravel beneath them. Claire, who was inside the station, had noticed them and stepped out into the sunlight, feeling the familiar tension in the air. This time, however, it was different. Jay cleared his throat, his voice quieter than Claire had ever heard it. "Hey, John," he started, his eyes avoiding the older man's gaze. I just wanted to say sorry for what happened that day." He hesitated, then added, "We were out of line." Randy nodded, stepping forward. "Yeah, man, we were just messing around. It wasn't right. We were wrong." John stood still for a moment, his expression unreadable. Claire watched her father, waiting to see what he would do. She knew that John wasn't the type to demand an apology, or even expect one, but there was something unspoken here. This wasn't about him. It was about the bikers realizing the consequences of their actions, and it was about redemption. John finally spoke, his voice low but firm. "Apologies are only worth something if you change. I don't need a bunch of words from you, Jake. What I need to see is respect. Respect for people, respect for their lives, and respect for what's right." Jake and Randy stood there, both visibly uncomfortable with the weight of John's words. But for the first time since Claire had met them, they weren't defensive. They weren't trying to explain themselves or make excuses. They were simply listening. John's calm authority had a way of demanding that. "Thank you for the apology," John said, his tone softening slightly. "But don't just apologize to me. Apologize to yourselves. Make sure you don't repeat the same mistakes." Jake nodded, his expression hardening slightly as he took a deep breath. "We will, promise." With that, the bikers turned to leave, their departure marked by a noticeable change in their attitudes. There was no snickering, no bravado, just a quiet acknowledgement that things had shifted. Maybe they didn't fully understand everything they had learned from the encounter. But one thing was clear. They were no longer the same men who had rolled into town with loud motorcycles and taunts. They were different now, and that difference came from the humility of recognizing when they had been wrong, and from the strength it took to admit it. As the bikers rode off into the distance, Claire walked up to her father, a sense of pride swelling inside her. There was something unspoken between them, something that had been solidified in the moment since the bikers had first arrived. She felt, perhaps more than ever before, the depth of their bond, quiet understanding that existed between them, the love that wasn't always spoken, but was always there. John smiled at her, a soft, knowing smile that told her he understood everything she was thinking without needing to say a word. "You all right, kiddo?" he asked, his voice steady. Claire nodded, her smile matching his. "I'm good, Dad. I'm more than good." She glanced toward the road where the bikers had disappeared, then back at her father. "You know," she said, her voice filled with quiet admiration, "you were right. What you said to them. It wasn't just about standing up to them. It was about making them see who they were, who they could be if they changed. It was about showing them respect, even when they didn't deserve it." John's smile grew a little wider. "Exactly. Respect's earned, Claire. It's not about winning every fight, but about knowing when to walk away and when to teach someone something important." Claire's eyes softened as she looked up at him. "You've taught me more than you know, Dad. I think I finally understand you. You're not just my dad, the one who takes care of me. You're also the man who stands for what's right, no matter what." John placed a hand on her shoulder, giving it a gentle squeeze. "And I'm proud of you, Claire. I've always been proud of you. You're strong, and you've got a good heart." They stood there for a long moment, the sun shining down on them, the small town of Ashford, quietly fading into the backdrop of their lives. The lessons of the past few weeks were not just about physical strength or confrontation. They were about something deeper, about standing for what's right, about knowing when to fight and when to show mercy, and about the bond between a father and daughter that could never be broken. And as they watched the sun set over the horizon, Claire knew that this moment, this lesson, would stay with her forever. It wasn't just a lesson about how to handle bullies or how to fight back. It was about life, about the importance of honor, humility, and strength, and about the love that tied them together. The summer days that followed the incident at the gas station were some of the busiest of John Harper's life. The town of Ashford seemed to buzz with a new energy, one that had taken root in the wake of the bikers' visit. People were more attentive to one another, more willing to stand up for what was right. It wasn't a loud revolution or a shift that happened overnight. It was subtle, slow, like a plant pushing its way through the cracks in the pavement. And at the center of it all was John, whose quiet example of strength continued to inspire everyone around him. John had always been a humble man, content with the simple life he had built after his years of service. His farm was small, but thriving, and Claire had become his heart, his purpose. He never sought attention, but now, as the community continued to reflect on his actions, he found himself becoming something of a local legend. John wasn't one to seek praise, but it wasn't lost on him that the town was different because of what had transpired. The respect he had always believed in, earned through deeds, not words, was now the foundation of a new understanding in Ashford. Claire's departure for college marked a bittersweet turning point in their lives. The day she left, John stood beside her, holding her luggage as they stood near the front door of their farmhouse. The morning sun cast a warm glow over the fields that stretched beyond them, the same fields that had been their home for as long as she could remember. John watched as Claire buckled herself into the car, his heart heavy with pride and a deep sense of longing. He had always known this day would come, the day when his little girl would spread her wings and fly on her own. It wasn't that he wasn't ready. It was the overwhelming realization that she was no longer a child. She was a strong, independent young woman with a future ahead of her, one that he had helped shape, even if in ways he never fully understood. He approached the car and leaned in, giving her a final hug. "I'm proud of you, Claire. Always have been, always will be." She smiled up at him, her eyes brimming with emotion. "I know, Dad. You've always been there for me, and I'll carry everything you've taught me with me." She paused, her voice soft but filled with a quiet strength. "I think I finally understand what you were trying to teach me. It's not just about standing up for yourself. It's about standing up for what's right, no matter the cost." John chuckled softly, a little choked up. "You've always had the right heart, kiddo. It's just about trusting that you'll know when to use it." As Claire pulled away from the farm and began her journey toward a future beyond Ashford, John stood watching her go, his heart full but steady. He had done his part. He'd given her the tools she needed to face the world on her own. The rest was up to her. The community of Ashford, too, had begun to change. The simple act of John standing his ground and demanding respect had made an impression on the people who lived there. It was as if a quiet revolution had taken place, one that didn't involve protest signs or speeches, but a shift in how people treated each other, how they stood up to bullies and recognized the value of self-respect. John's story became a reference point, a quiet touchstone for anyone in the town who found themselves faced with a difficult decision. They knew that strength didn't come from violence. It came from the courage to stand firm and honor what was right. As Claire drove away, the day seemed to hold a special kind of quiet peace. It wasn't just the stillness of the morning. It was the sense of completion, of a cycle coming full circle. John had raised his daughter to be strong, to be resilient, and now she was ready to take that strength into the world. The story of what happened at the gas station, however, was far from over. The bikers, who had once sought to intimidate and humiliate, had returned with an apology and a newfound sense of humility. Jake and Randy had learned the power of respect, and that message, of knowing when to fight and when to walk away, had not only reshaped their attitudes, but had inspired others too. The way the bikers had left Ashford that day, their heads held a little lower, their pride a little less boisterous, had made people realize that redemption was possible, no matter how far you had fallen. And for Claire, a journey was just beginning. She would face new challenges, meet new people, and find her way in a world far different from the one she had grown up in. But no matter where she went, the lessons her father had taught her, the importance of standing up for herself, the value of respect, and the strength of quiet resilience would stay with her. This story reminds us that strength is not always about physical might, but about standing up for what's right, with courage and dignity. The father's unwavering stance not only protected his daughter, but also taught an unforgettable lesson about respect. Let us carry this message in our hearts and strive to make our world a kinder place. If you found this story inspiring, Please like, share, and subscribe to our channel for more heartwarming and powerful stories. See you in the next one.